A few months ago, I was really excited to hear about a bipartisan civic education bill at the federal level, which is now referred to as the Civics Secures Democracy Act. I believe you're the lead lobbyist for this bill. Is that right?
That's right.
So could you please give us an overview of the provisions contained in the Civics Secures Democracy Act?
So the CSD is the first really comprehensive piece of civic education legislation that tries to take everything that we know about how kids most effectively learn about American government and democracy and how it works and put that into action. So if it were signed into law, the legislation would provide $1 billion a year for 5 years to invest in multiple simultaneous approaches that help to support civic education. What does that mean? What does that look like? So one part of the bill would provide funding to states and to local school boards and schools to teach civic education in classrooms, because civic education is being really squeezed out of a lot of schools and curriculum that are focusing on other subjects and have decided they just don't have time for civics anymore. So there'd be funding to help create incentives for schools to return to teaching civics. There is funding for nonprofit organizations that develop programs and curricula and approaches to teaching civics that help to engage students. Traditional approaches to teaching history and civics, sort of starting with Plymouth Rock and marching through the history of our country, engage some kids, but a lot of kids don't relate to that. And there's been a lot of research developing approaches that do actually get kids engaged in and excited about civics, kind of like my fairy tale bakery experience. Mm-hmm. When I was a teacher, I encouraged my students to choose issues they cared about and do research on them and get engaged in them. I didn't care what issue they chose, and I didn't care what side of that issue they chose. I wanted them to work on an issue that motivated them. So there are curricula and programs that help teachers help their students become engaged and research how to get involved in the issues that they care about. Research is really important, not just research into civics and civic education, but research into what is effective in different classrooms. And there's no one-size-fits-all approach, right? Different things work for different schools, different communities, different students. So there's funding in this bill to continue research about how to most effectively teach students. Teachers also need help. They need support. They need professional development opportunities, because nobody knows you're not born knowing how to teach this effectively. So there are also resources in the legislation to provide professional development opportunities for teachers so they can learn how to teach civics effectively. And there are some fellowships for really talented and motivated teachers to have summer experiences and really dig in and hone their skills as civic educators. And lastly, but not least, there's a program called the Nation's Report Card, where a sample of students across the country take exams in the 4th, 8th, and 12th grade in different subjects. And it gives us an objective national view of how students are doing in the subjects in which they're tested. And the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, which is what this test is called, is not consistently offered in civics and government. And it's not offered to enough students for us to get a really good picture of how kids in Florida are doing compared to kids in Oklahoma or Texas or California or any other state. So the last piece of this legislation would expand the number of students that are taking this sample test in civics and government and administer that test more regularly so we can have a sense of which states are doing a good job on civic education and which states aren't. So it's a multi-layer, comprehensive piece of legislation that's trying to tackle the civic education crisis from every direction that we know how.
Well, thanks, Kat, for that overview. So let me just review. You said it's $1 billion a year for 5 years, and then there are 5 different aspects that will get funded. States will get some funding to do this type of civic education they want to do. There will be curriculum and programs developed that will be available to
That's right.
many people. Is that right?
Yes.
And then research, professional development and fellowships, and then assessment through the NAEP.
That's right.
Those are the 5 aspects.
Those are the 5 big pieces.
The 5 big pieces. So how is funding carved up among those 5 pieces? Is much of it going to the states, or is much of it going to PD? How is it proposed to work right now?
So the bulk of the funding goes out through grants to states and through the states to local education agencies. And then there are smaller amounts for the research, the professional development. So I guess the second largest piece in the bill is the funding for the nonprofit organizations that develop the curriculum and programs that states and schools use. So the single largest amount is for states to implement civic education, but the second largest amount is for the developers of the programs that states would choose to use in classrooms.
So what are the stipulations around what states would be expected to do with the funding?
So there are a couple criteria for how states can use this. They need to develop a plan that shows how they would use the money to improve civic education. They need to show that most of the money will go to school districts and schools. They can't keep the majority of the funds at the state level. It's got to go down to the schools and the teachers who are teaching this subject. They need to show that they will implement programs that are based in the research, what we know is effective. And lastly, they need to agree to participate in the NAEP tests in civics and government. So it's not a terribly high bar, but it's criteria that we think will ensure that the money is used effectively.
And who oversees this once it gets, if it gets passed? Who ensures that states are meeting these criteria?
So like all other federal funds for education, it would be administered through the United States Department of Education, which it has a lot of experience administering grants and funds like this.
Great. So you mentioned the development of curriculum and programs. What types of curriculum and programs would you imagine being developed through this? And are there certain organizations that are expecting to see greater support from if this bill were to be passed?
So there's a really wide variety of organizations that develop programming and curriculum in civics. I work with Civics Now, which is a coalition of more than 80 nonprofit organizations that care about civic education, and many of them develop programs and approaches that can be used in classrooms. You know, one of the things that's really important here, and is not just important in civics, but important in all aspects of education, students learn differently. And education works differently in different parts of the country, in different communities, and for different students. So one curriculum, one approach doesn't work in math, it doesn't work in science, doesn't work in English, and it doesn't work in civics. And so the goal of funding, having a competitive grant program where developers of curriculum can apply for resources, and then schools and school districts teachers who are working with kids can take a look at a variety of programs and figure out what is going to work best for their students in their communities. So, Icivics, as an example, is an organization that was created by Justice Sandra Day O'Connor to help promote an understanding first of how the judicial branch in American government works, and then they expanded it to the other three branches of American government.
Mm-hmm.
And they use games and videos to engage students and help make this learning fun. The Constitutional Rights
Mm-hmm.
Foundation, which was the first organization that approached me 10 years ago to work on civic education advocacy, they see themselves as the lab portion of a government class, just like you wouldn't teach chemistry without giving people an opportunity to do the labs and see what happens when you mix chemicals together. They create the lab section of a government class where they have materials to help students investigate an issue that they care about, figure out who's responsible for developing or enforcing policy on that thing
Mm-hmm.
that they care about, and then putting their ideas and concerns into action with those government agencies that are responsible for policy. So there's a lot
Mm-hmm.
of different approaches, and we want to make sure that schools have access to choose the one that works best for them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the Civic Secures Democracy Act would create a funding stream for many of these organizations. You said there are 80 organizations that you work with. How would they get the funding? Would they have to apply, or would it be distributed in a specific way? Okay, an application process. You're nodding your head.
Yep, it would be a competitive application process. So
Mm-hmm.
there'd be a pot of funding each year for 5 years. The Department of Education would develop a grant process with criteria, and folks would have to submit applications to be funded.
Okay. Okay. Great. And professional development seems extremely important in this
I would
process
agree.
because there are a lot of curricula and programs that can be developed, but figuring out how to use them and how to integrate them with the standards in your own state or in your district can be a challenge. So, what's the vision for professional development?
Absolutely. You know, when I was a young teacher, I was so fortunate to have really great curriculum and really great mentor teachers who helped
Mm-hmm.
me make sure that I was doing a good job for my kids in my
Mm-hmm.
classroom. A couple of years ago, the Iowa Council for the Social Studies did a survey of the teachers in their state who were teaching civic education and discovered that more than half of them had not even been offered a professional development opportunity in their field in
Hmm.
the previous several years. And
Hmm.
that doesn't mean half of them didn't have an opportunity to take advantage of that PD. It means half of them had not even been offered the opportunity for
Wow.
PD in their
Mm-hmm.
field. So we know this is really important. A lot of PD is offered through colleges and universities. So organizations with expertise in teacher professional development would also have the opportunity to put together programs, compete for funds to run those programs. And then
Mm-hmm.
schools would take a look at the PD offerings, decide what, again, will work best to meet the needs of their teachers and their schools, and choose what PD courses they want their staff to participate in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
One of the important themes you can hear in this legislation, and one of the reasons that it has bipartisan support from Democrats and Republicans, is this idea that we want to reinforce and not undermine local control of education. And we want to
Mm-hmm.
give schools, principals, and teachers the tools that they need to do a great job with civic education for their students and their community.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, this sounds like quite an impressive bill. And it sounds like this bill would be a game changer and would really could change the trajectory of civic education in the US. Why now? How did this come about in 2021?
An understanding of the need for civic education is not new. And
Mhm.
um, Congressman Cole, in particular, of Oklahoma, who is the lead Republican on this legislation in the House of Representatives, with Congresswoman DeLauro of Connecticut, who is the lead Democrat on the legislation. Congressman Cole has been working on different approaches to civic education and legislation to promote civic education for the last 10 years. The programs and the legislation have been modest. The Sandra Day O'Connor Civic Learning Act authorized $40 million in competitive grants to nonprofit organizations to do the kinds of programming and curriculum development that we have been talking about. But there was never a really comprehensive piece of legislation that tackled all of the levers that we could use to improve civic education outcomes until
Mhm.
the Civic Secures Democracy Act. That legislation was initially introduced a little more than a year ago, but I do think that over the last few years, there's been a new understanding across the political spectrum of
Mhm.
the extent to which we're suffering from the defunding of civics and the absence of
Mhm.
civics in our classrooms for the last 2 or 3 decades.
Mhm.
So it has become really clear to us that we need to do a better job of helping people understand how democracy works, of elevating media literacy, of
Mhm.
helping people disagree and have
Mhm.
conversations about the things they disagree on without being disagreeable, without hating people on the other
Mhm.
side. Um, you know, Justice O'Connor talked about how a knowledge and understanding of our democratic system of government is not passed down through the gene pool. It has to be taught again and again to each successive generation. And as we have focused on really important efforts to elevate literacy education, to elevate science, technology, math, we've kind of lost our civic education, and that has
Mhm.
consequences.
Yeah, it is interesting and notable that this is gaining a lot of momentum in 2021 after the January 6th insurrection. Um, and it just seems like that might have added fuel to the fire that is behind this legislation. There has been as you mentioned, that there has been an effort to improve civic education for a long time, and legislators have wanted this type of effort and this type of expansion of civic education, but it hasn't actually gotten this far, correct?
That's right. So the need for civic education has been around for a while. I do think there's a different urgency after
Mm-hmm.
the January 6th insurrection. Um, as I said, this legislation was written and introduced long before January 6th, and both
Okay.
Congressman Cole and Congresswoman DeLauro have a long history of working on this issue, but the attention and the urgency has absolutely changed. I think that's right.
In our last conversation, you mentioned that Congress has been much more forthcoming with support for STEM education than it has for civics and social studies education. Could you talk a bit about how the Civic Secures Democracy Act fits into the broader trend of the federal government supporting or not supporting civic education compared to its support for other aspects of education?
So the federal government has created incentives and support for teaching other subjects that it thinks are important, with STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math being at the top of that list. So federal funding for the teaching of STEM, in the last numbers that we have, totaled about $50 per U.S. school child. And for civic education, it's been more like a nickel. The programs that have been funded are very small, they're very limited, and they touch a small number of very highly talented teachers and students, and one nonprofit program developer a year, essentially. It's been a very limited approach.
Mm-hmm.
The Civic Secures Democracy Act is a sea change, and it treats the support of civic education much more the way we treat STEM and literacy. So by providing more funding, and it's a huge amount of money compared to what's there for civics. It's a drop in the bucket compared to what is there for STEM and literacy. I mean, we should be really clear. This is ambitious compared to what is currently in place for civics, but it's very small compared to STEM and literacy. But by taking a comprehensive approach and not just funding one piece, it's not just professional development, it's not just curriculum development, and by trying to touch more schools, more students, more teachers, we would be shifting through the Civic Secures Democracy Act to make civic education policy and support look more like the way the federal government supports and incentivizes teaching of STEM and literacy.
That's great. So this is a bipartisan bill, but nothing is a sure thing in Congress. How likely do you think it is that this bill will pass? And what does the process look like from here forward?
So there's a lot of interest in and excitement about this piece of legislation, which is wonderful. There's a lot going on in Washington right now, a lot of problems that people are grappling with, and getting attention for any one issue, even something that feels as important to folks like me as civics, can be a challenge. So organizations that do civic education, that care about civic education, teachers of civic education and history, parents, have been reaching out to members of Congress to introduce the legislation to them and to ask for their support for the bill. One of the questions that is frequently asked is, how would the bill be paid for, and what funding might be cut in other places to create room for this to be funded. So there's actually going to be an updated version of the legislation introduced in the coming weeks, and it will answer that question. It will have what's known inside Washington as a pay for. And there are also going to be some tweaks to the language just to really clarify that the intent is not to have the federal government dictating civic education policy, that the intent is to empower and incentivize teachers, principals, schools, and school districts to add civic education back to their program and their curriculum. So we're looking forward to having the legislation reintroduced, and then our job here in DC is always to find a vehicle that can carry the bill. When you watched Schoolhouse Rock, and I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting on Capitol Hill, there are a lot of small bills, and they don't get passed individually. They tend to be bundled up into large packages. So as we get more co-sponsors for the legislation, build public awareness and awareness and support on Capitol Hill, then the next job is to figure out what package can this be added to so that it gets to the
Hmm.
president's desk and can start making a difference for teachers and kids.
Hmm. Hmm. So ultimately, will it be known as the CSD bill, even though it will be packaged with something else?
Yes, it would be.
Okay. 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 In the meantime, I'll bet a lot of people listening think this sounds like a great idea, and there are many things in this bill that they would love to see come to fruition sooner rather than later. So, what can our listeners do to support this legislation?
So the single most important thing that folks can do is contact their members of Congress, their representative and their two senators, and ask them to support the Civic Secures Democracy Act. Um,
Mm-hmm.
One of the most frequent questions that I was asked when I was working on Capitol Hill was, do people pay attention to constituents, and do constituent contacts really matter?
Mm-hmm.
And I used to tell a story. Do we have time for a short story?
Oh, yeah.
So when I was working on Capitol Hill in 1994, um, Speaker Gingrich was not Speaker yet. Um, One of the things that he talked about was if he became Speaker of the House, he would never allow a piece of legislation that funded public television and public radio to come to the floor of the House of Representatives. He did not believe that that was a good use of federal funding, and he would never allow that to move forward. So
Mm-hmm.
my dad, who was in his 50s and was civically engaged as a volunteer, but had never written to his member of Congress, called me up and asked for the address, not just of his own representative, but of all of the representatives from the state that he was living in. And this was kind of pre-internet, and because I'm old, and it took a long time to give him the address of all of those members of Congress. He's from a big state, and there were more than 50 members, and he sat down and he wrote a letter to each of them. I
Mm-hmm.
changed jobs in early 1995, and when I came to my new office, there was a stack of mail that was taller than I am. And I'm 5'3", so I'm not hugely tall, but 5'3" of paper is a
It's a
lot
lot of
of
mail.
paper. And
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was probably all of the mail that had been received on all of the issues that I covered. And I was told no. Those were the letters that had been received from constituents and others across the country just on the funding of public television and public radio.
Mm-hmm.
You might not be surprised that the first year that Mr. Gingrich was Speaker of the House of Representatives, a funding bill came to the floor of House of Representatives and was passed that continued funding for public radio and public television. And the next year, with continued public outcry, actually public radio and public television got a funding increase.
Mm-hmm.
People reaching out, talking to their members of Congress, participating in town hall meetings, sending emails, making phone calls, writing old-fashioned letters, they make a difference. And I can't encourage folks who care about this strongly enough, or care about other things. Communicate with your congressional offices, because in a democracy, it does change outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Somebody told me one time that there was a rough calculation that for every letter that was received from a constituent, people in legislative offices estimated that about 100 other people had that same sentiment. I don't know if you've ever heard that rule of thumb, but it was from someone who worked on Capitol Hill.
We didn't use that estimator in any of the 3 congressional offices that I worked in, but we absolutely knew that the number of people who take the time for that outreach is a small fraction of the people who share those beliefs and opinions. The other thing is there are some issues that congressional offices get huge numbers of contacts around. Tax issues,
Mm-hmm.
Social Security, Medicare. Education issues, there are not as many people reaching out and communicating. And so a small number of letters or emails actually gets a little bit of disproportionate attention because it's
Hmm.
not something that you hear from as many people about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. This is bipartisan, so it's very exciting. So one question that I have is, if it's bipartisan and there's so much support for it, why can't it just go through quickly?
Well, so even issues that seem like they should be mom and apple pie can get polarized in Washington. Um, there are people who are concerned. They feel like the federal government has already spent too much money on a wide variety of things and worry about spending more. There are folks who philosophically believe that the federal government shouldn't be supporting education at all, that funding for education should come exclusively from states and um, local government property taxes, whatever the funding source is at the community level. So even on broad issues where there's a lot of bipartisan support and agreement, sometimes when you get into the details, it gets complicated. When I walk into a congressional office to talk about civic education, I have a certain advantage. Every staff person that I talked to had some experience at some point in their lives that inspired them to go into public service and government. And in most
Mm-hmm.
cases, it was a great history or government or civics teacher that they had
Mm-hmm.
in school. And they have an innate appreciation of the importance of good teaching
Mm-hmm.
in civics and history. And most members
Mm-hmm.
of Congress also understand that as well. So we're lucky on the issue of civic education. We begin from a place of understanding and support. But then you get into the details, and the details can be complicated. So it takes a little time to work out the details. But we start from a good place of shared values and understanding.
Are you and your colleagues afraid that if this were to pass by a narrow margin, that it could end up being temporary, or rolled back later? I think I think to a lot of observers of politics right now, it seems that many things are passed by a narrow margin. Some major pieces of legislation are passed by a narrow margin that is often highly partisan. So for something to be a little bit bipartisan is very exciting. To get one Republican vote on a Democratic bill, it's like, oh, it was bipartisan. So to have two sponsors in each
In the
house,
House and
um,
Senate. Yep. So we have
in the House
talked
and
about
Senate.
Senator Coons of Delaware and Senator Cornyn of Texas, who are the Senate co-sponsors, and again, as you say, a bipartisan team.
Yeah, so to have that is pretty exciting, and it means, well, this is passable. Um, but it sounds like you would want to get just broader support, like maybe 70 votes, 80 votes, 90 votes in the Senate. I'm not sure what you're hoping for. Maybe unanimous. I'm not sure what the goal is, but it seems like if it were like 55 to 45 in the Senate, well, it was controversial and maybe in 2 years it will get rolled back. I mean, is that part of your concern?
So politics is about the art of the possible. And I will
Mm-hmm.
be happy to get enough votes in the House and Senate to pass the legislation. I think where the rubber
Mm-hmm.
hits the road is what happens then. So there are
Mm-hmm.
very, very few pieces of legislation that are passed that create some kind of program that is permanent and funded forever. And
Mm-hmm.
this is a bill like the vast majority of bills. It's a 5-year authorization. So if it passes, it will be in place for 5 years. There will be rounds of grant applications. Money will go out to schools, school districts, colleges and universities to do PD. Nonprofit organizations will start getting more information from the NAEP, and we'll see how it works. And at the end of 5 years, there will be an opportunity to take a look at this and say, was it effective? Did it do what it was supposed to do? Was it abused? Was it manipulated? Was it, did it lead to an improvement in the teaching of civics? Did it lead to more students getting civic education than are getting it now without the legislation? So I'm less concerned about the vote count. I want enough votes for it to happen. And then if it's effective, it will get continued and maybe expanded bipartisan support. And if it's not effective, then it won't get support, and we're going to have to tweak it or fix it, figure out why it's not working and how to make it work better. And that's the reason that you authorize most programs for a limited amount of time, frequently 4 years or 5 years, because it forces that reevaluation to see, is it doing what we intended it to do, and does it deserve to be continued? Does it need to be tweaked? Does it need to be fixed? Or does it need to be thrown overboard and try something else?
Yeah, so it sounds like part of your process is, it sounds like in this process of trying to get the bill passed, you're also considering what will make it most effective and most successful. So you see this tweaking process, this adjustment process, as not only political, but also strategic for the success of what you want to see happen.
That's right, because if we end up spending all this time and effort getting this in place and it doesn't make a difference and it doesn't move the needle on civic education, then it will all have been in vain.
Well, thank you so much for all of your work on this and for taking the time to talk to me and to the listeners.
Well, Brett, thank you. Thank you for what you are doing to support and expand civic education, including of your listeners. And thank you to all of your listeners for spending time thinking and caring about this.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, we'll be in touch.
I will look forward to it. Take care.
Okay. All right. And good luck with this work, because and I look forward to seeing what happens with it, in 2021, 2022, or whenever it gets through.
Well, thank you. We will need the luck, but we will also need lots of people putting their shoulders to the wheel. So everyone is invited to come and join the effort.
All right, great. So letters. And if they wanted to have somebody speak to their students or their PTAs, how could they do that? I think people will listen to this, spread the word. Are there any people, they could, play this podcast for people. Are there any direct communication opportunities with people who are working on this legislation?
Absolutely. So I mentioned the Civics Now Coalition, which is spelled CIVX Now Coalition, which is led by Icivics, but is that coalition that I talked about of more than 80 nonprofit organizations that care about civic education. And Sean Healy with Civics Now does training for teachers, students, PTAs, others. So if folks are interested in having some training, learning more, having a presentation done to their groups or organizations, please contact Civics Now, and we would be delighted to make that happen.
Kat, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Take care.
All right, we'll put a bunch of those links in the show notes, so take a look at the show notes.